How's it going, guys? Julian Bradley here from themusicalear.com. Today I'm going to teach you how to create a clean mix, clean arrangement. So what is a clean mix? It's basically the opposite of a muddy mix where all the sounds are in the sort of blurring together. It's very hard to decipher each instrument and to separate them with your ear. So this is a common mistake. In fact, it's the norm when most people write music. Their music ends up sounding muddy. So in this video, I'm going to share with you my 3 top tips for creating a clean mix. Enjoy the video. So I'm going to start with the first tip, the most important of all these 3 tips. I'm not going to do a countdown, I'm going to start with the most important tip. To create a clean mix, you have to obey the first rule of orchestration. So this is a concept which I learnt in my classical training, but it applies to every type of music, whether you're making dance music, hip hop, jazz, film soundtracks, classical. They all follow this basic rule of orchestration. To create a clean mix, you must assign each instrument its own frequency range, typically an octave, and you just reserve that octave for that one instrument. So the bass has its own octave. Then above that, you might have some chords, some type of keyboard instrument or guitar. Above that, you might have a synth pad just in the background. That's common in most popular music. You'll have just a pad at the back of the mix. And then an octave above that, you might have the vocal line, if it's a female singer. If it was a male singer, it might be an octave below. And then above that, I don't know, not too much. You'll certainly have the hi-hats. And pretty much that's about it. So when you follow this basic principle of just keeping each instrument in its own frequency range, you end up with a clean mix every time. And you almost don't have to do anything else. You don't have to do any EQ or mixing techniques. It just sounds clean from the start. So in all the videos which I've watched, I've never heard this mentioned once. I've heard all these advanced EQ techniques and how to separate instruments, but I've never heard this orchestration rule mentioned once. It's pretty much why I'm making this video, because this is the most important concept of all. When you're composing music, just have in the back of your mind that each instrument has to have its own space in the mix. Now, typically I recommend an octave per instrument. However, you can squeeze it down to about a fifth per instrument, so you have a certain melody line that's within a fifth. And I guess one other thing is that you don't ever want to exceed 5 instruments at a time, because the brain can only process 5 different sounds at a time. So if you add in 6, 7, 8 different things going on, well, the brain just gets overwhelmed. So you want to be clear with which notes you intend to be played for your music to sound its best, and then you just cut out any notes which aren't essential to the mix. Now the second tip to create a clean mix is less important, but it is important. This is a technology tip. If you're using a sequencer like Logic or Pro Tools, where you want to put what's called a high-pass filter on every single track. So a high-pass filter is a type of EQ. It affects the frequencies which are allowed through. So it basically filters out the bass and it allows the high frequencies to pass. That's why it's called a high-pass filter. And you can adjust the high-pass setting, so where that high-pass filter kicks in, but you want to apply a high-pass filter to every single track, every single instrument, and by doing that you're scooping out and filtering out all of these unnecessary bass frequencies which really add up when they're coming through on every single instrument. And those bass frequencies really drain the speaker of its power, because the bass takes a lot more energy than the highs. So you want to filter out and get in the habit of shaving off all the unnecessary bass frequencies. You do that for every single instrument. Now, when you're adjusting the high pass filter to find how high you can shave off, it's important to find the lowest note for that instrument in the whole piece of music, because otherwise you could be setting that high pass filter and then you're not realizing that later in the piece there's a really low note and that low note's not even going to get through. So you just loop that one measure where the lowest note is, and you're basically just going to raise that high pass filter slowly until you find the point where it starts to cut off with the note, and then you just leave it at the point just before it cuts off. So that's tip number 2, high pass filter, and apply it to every single track. So my final tip is a bit geeky, a bit technical. It's actually one of my favorite though. So this is when you do have two instruments which overlap in the same frequency range. Sometimes it's unavoidable. Typically this will often be a bass line and a kick drum. Often these two instruments overlap in the same bass frequency. So how do we separate these two instruments and stop them from sounding muddy? Well, there's a really nice trick which I guess we can call inverted EQ. So you'll take one of the instruments, probably the most important instrument, start by EQing that instrument first, and you want to boost a certain frequency by about 2 decibels. Typically you'll find the most characteristic frequency of that instrument, which embodies the sound of that instrument, and you'll just give it a boost by about 2 decibels. And then you'll cut a certain frequency by about 2 decibels, and usually you'll just find an area which isn't needed for that sound. So here's where the cool part happens. You're going to take that EQ that you've created and you're going to make an exact copy of it and apply it to the second instrument that's overlapping in the same area. Now what we're going to do is we're going to invert that EQ and basically make a mirror image of it. So that means where you boosted by 2 decibels, we're now going to duck by 2 decibels. And where you had ducked by 2 decibels, we're now going to boost by 2 decibels. So we're inverting the EQ, and what the result is that it just separates these two instruments. And it works really, really well. And it's always really rewarding when you've inverted these two EQs to just hit play, and it's just like magic. You hear the two are just completely separate. Now there are several common scenarios where I use this technique. Number one is probably with a bass line and kick drum. Another situation where you'll often need to use it is for a vocalist. If you want to separate the lead vocal and really make it stand out in the music, well, I'll often use this technique again. I'll just boost and cut, and then I'll mirror that EQ onto the backing music. Where I boosted, I'll cut, and where I ducked, I'll boost. And then one final situation where I use it a lot is when I'm doing voiceover, and again, I have a vocal with some backing music, as in many of my videos. Well, again, it really helps with voiceover to separate my voice, make my voice stand out against the background. Again, I'll just boost and cut, and then I'll mirror that EQ onto the backing music. Where I boosted, I'll cut. Where I cut, I'll boost it. Now I actually have a bonus tip which I just thought of actually, and what you can do is you can go through every single instrument and you can just duck the frequency range between 200 and 500 Hertz. Why 200 to 500 Hertz? Well, this is exactly in the midpoint of most human hearing, and basically every single instrument seems to overlap in this range. So what you get is this mid-range just building up. For example, the hi-hat goes down as low as 200 Hertz sometimes, or snare drum certainly does. The kick drum comes up to the 200, 500 Hertz. Bassline comes up. Everything just overlaps in that 200 to 500 Hertz range. So what you can do is just go through every single instrument one at a time and just dip slightly in that 200 to 500 Hertz range. And when you do that, just a little effect on each instrument, but it all adds up. And the result, again, is a much cleaner mix. So So really that ends up as 4 tips. Again, to recap, number 1, rule of orchestration, give each instrument its own octave. Number 2, high pass filter on every single instrument. Number 3, if you do have overlapping instruments, well, use inverted EQ to separate them. And finally, number 4, go through every single instrument and dip slightly between the 200 and 500 Hertz range. So that's basically everything you need to know to create a clean mix. If you follow these tips, then you will create a really clean piece of music every time. My name's Julian Bradley, thanks for watching. If you found this video useful, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up. Make sure you don't miss out on future videos by subscribing to my channel. And I have a free giveaway, which is 8 of my license-free music tracks. So these are compositions just like the ones you heard in the interludes for this video, and these are license-free music, which means you can use these for whatever you like.